In the blood-soaked annals of Roman Imperial history, few stories capture the depths of human cruelty and desperation quite like that of Sporus, a beautiful young boy whose fate became intertwined with one of history's most notorious emperors. This is not merely a tale of political intrigue or military conquest, but a haunting examination of power's ability to strip away humanity itself, leaving behind only the grotesque theater of imperial whim. Sporus' story unfolds like a nightmare within the marble halls of ancient Rome, where the line between love and possession, between honor and degradation, dissolved entirely under the mad gaze of Nero. He was born a person, with a name whispered by his mother and dreams of his own. But in the grand, cruel narrative of Rome, he would become a thing. A living doll, a ghost of a dead empress, a symbol of an emperor's descent into madness. His name, Sporus, would echo through history not for his own achievements, but for the horrors inflicted upon him. This is the story of the boy who was unmade, of a life stolen and reshaped by the hands of an emperor who believed the world was his stage, and every person in it a mere player. To understand the tragedy of Sporus, we must first return to a time before the emperor's shadow fell upon him, to a world where he was simply a boy with a future yet unwritten. Long before the gilded cages of the Domus Aurea became his prison, Sporus was a child of the Sabina, Rome's teeming, vibrant, and often dangerous underbelly. He was not born into the purple of the imperial family, nor did he possess the proud lineage of the senatorial class. Sporus was a freedman's son, a fact that placed him in a liminal space within the rigid Roman social hierarchy. He was free, but the ghost of servitude clung to his family like a stubborn shadow. His father, a Greek freedman named Lycomedes, had earned his freedom through years of diligent service as a scribe to a wealthy patrician. Lycomedes was a man of quiet dignity and sharp intellect, his hands stained with the ink that had bought his family's liberty. He had instilled in his son a love for letters and a quiet hope for a future beyond the grime and clamor of their neighborhood. Sporus' mother, a Roman woman of humble birth, had a gentler spirit, her love for her son a fierce, protective flame. She saw in his delicate features and large, dark eyes a beauty that both thrilled and terrified her. In a city like Rome, beauty could be a currency, a blessing, or a curse. For a boy of Sporus' station, she feared it would be the latter. Sporus was a quiet, observant child. While other boys his age played boisterous games in the narrow, winding streets of the Sabina, he would often be found in the small courtyard of their insula, tracing letters in the dirt with a stick, or listening to his father recite verses from Homer and Virgil. He possessed a natural grace and a striking beauty that turned heads even in the crowded marketplace. His hair was a cascade of dark curls, his skin the color of pale ivory, and his eyes, deep and soulful, seemed to hold a wisdom far beyond his years. This ethereal beauty, so out of place in the squalor of his surroundings, was a source of both pride and anxiety for his parents. Lycomedes, through his old connections, managed to secure a position for Sporus as an attendant in the household of a lesser senator. It was a step up from the Sabina, a chance for the boy to learn the ways of the elite, to perhaps even catch the eye of a patron who could elevate his status. Sporus, then a boy of about 13, was both excited and apprehensive. The senatorial villa on the Esquiline Hill was a world away from the chaotic energy of his home. Here, there were manicured gardens, intricate mosaics, and a hushed silence broken only by the gentle murmur of fountains and the rustle of silk. For a time, life was stable. Sporus, with his quick mind and pleasing demeanor, proved to be an adept servant. He learned to anticipate his master's needs, to move silently through the opulent halls, and to keep his eyes downcast in the presence of his betters. He was a ghost in a palace, an observer of a world he could never truly belong to. He saw the whispered intrigues, the casual cruelty of the powerful, and the fragile nature of fortune in a city that could raise a man to the heavens one day and cast him to the lions the next. It was during this time that he first heard the name of the Emperor Nero spoken with a mixture of fear and awe. The emperor was a young man himself, a lover of the arts, a poet and a musician, but also a man whose whims could mean life or death. The whispers in the villa spoke of his extravagances, his scandalous affairs, and his growing paranoia. Sporus, in his naivety, could not have imagined that his own destiny was about to collide with that of the most powerful man in the world. He was still just a boy, a freedman's son, dreaming of a modest future. But fate, in its cruel and unpredictable way, had other plans. A single, fleeting glance would soon shatter his world and cast him into the heart of the Imperial storm. The year was 65 AD. A pall of grief and suspicion hung over Rome. The city was still scarred from the great fire that had ravaged it the year before, and whispers of the emperor's madness echoed through its streets like smoke from the still smoldering ruins. But a more personal tragedy had struck the imperial court. Poppaea Sabina, Nero's second wife, the great love of his tumultuous life, was dead. The official story was that she had died from complications during childbirth, but the rumors were far more sinister. It was said that Nero, in a fit of rage, had kicked his pregnant wife to death. Whether out of guilt, genuine grief, or a narcissistic need for a perfect object of his affection, Nero was inconsolable. He mourned Poppaea with an extravagant, theatrical grief that bordered on madness. He ordered her body to be embalmed, not cremated as was Roman custom, and gave her a state funeral fit for a goddess. He even had a statue of her erected in the temple of Venus Genitrix. But no amount of public spectacle could fill the void she had left in his life, or perhaps in his carefully constructed self-image. It was in this state of melancholic obsession that Nero's gaze first fell upon Sporus. The senator whom Sporus served was a regular at the imperial court, and Sporus, as his attendant, would sometimes accompany him to the Domus Aurea, Nero's sprawling golden palace. The palace was a monument to Nero's ego, a labyrinth of opulent halls, revolving dining rooms and artificial lakes. To a boy from the Subura, it was a place of terrifying splendor. One evening, during a lavish banquet, Sporus was tasked with refilling wine goblets for his master and his guests. He moved through the crowded room with his usual quiet grace, his eyes downcast. But as he passed the imperial couch where Nero reclined, a guest's careless gesture sent a silver cup clattering to the floor. Sporus, startled, looked up, and for a fleeting moment, his eyes met the emperor's. In that instant, the world seemed to stop. The cacophony of the banquet, the music, the laughter, the drunken shouts, all faded into a distant hum. Nero, his face a mask of grief and dissipation, stared at Sporus with an intensity that sent a chill down the boy's spine. The emperor's eyes, usually clouded with a languid boredom, were suddenly sharp and focused. He saw in Sporus's delicate features, in the curve of his lips and the shape of his eyes, an uncanny resemblance to his beloved Poppaea. The resemblance was not perfect, of course. Sporus was a boy, and Poppaea had been a woman renowned for her beauty and sophistication. But in Nero's grief-addled mind, the similarities were overwhelming. He saw in Sporus a chance to reclaim what he had lost, to resurrect his dead Empress in a new, more pliable form. He saw not a person, but a vessel, a living canvas upon which he could project his desires and obsessions. The emperor beckoned Sporus forward. The boy, trembling, approached the imperial couch, his heart pounding in his chest. Nero reached out and traced the line of Sporus's jaw with a single manicured finger. "What is your name, boy?" he asked, his voice a soft, dangerous whisper. "Sporus, my lord," the boy managed to stammer. "Sporus," Nero repeated, a strange, unsettling smile playing on his lips. "A beautiful name for a beautiful face. You remind me of someone I loved dearly." From that moment on, Sporus's fate was sealed. The senator, eager to curry favor with the emperor, readily offered the boy as a gift. Sporus was taken from his master's villa and brought to the Domus Aurea, to the heart of imperial power. He was given new clothes, bathed in scented oils, and treated with a strange mixture of reverence and objectification. He was no longer an attendant, but he was not yet an empress. He was a curiosity, an object of the emperor's burgeoning obsession. For Sporus, this was a time of confusion and terror. He was surrounded by unimaginable luxury, but he was also a prisoner, He missed his family, his simple life, and the familiar chaos of the Sabura. He was a boy caught in the web of a madman's grief, a pawn in a game he did not understand. He did not yet know the full extent of Nero's plans for him, but he could feel a creeping dread in the emperor's possessive gaze. The unmaking of Sporus had begun. The days that followed that first fateful encounter were a surreal blur for Sporus. He was moved from the simple servants' quarters to a lavishly appointed suite of rooms within the Golden Palace. Silks replaced his rough-spun tunics, and meals of exotic fruits and spiced meats replaced the simple fare he had known. He was attended by servants who moved with a hushed reverence, their eyes a mixture of pity and fear. He was a gilded bird in a cage, and the cage was growing smaller every day. Nero's obsession intensified with each passing week. The emperor would summon Sporus at all hours, sometimes to simply sit and stare at him for long, unnerving stretches of time. He would talk to Sporus not as a boy, but as a confidant, a ghost, a mirror of his lost love. He began to call him "my little Sabina" in the privacy of his chambers, his voice thick with a cloying, possessive affection. The court, ever attuned to the emperor's moods, began to understand the terrifying direction of his fantasy. Courtiers who had once ignored the boy now offered him fawning compliments. The very air in the Domus Aurea seemed to hum with a grotesque anticipation. Sporus felt it like a change in the weather, a coming storm. He was no longer a person, he was a project. The decision, when it came, was delivered with the casual cruelty that had become Nero's trademark. The emperor, deep in his cups and melancholic, was lamenting the impossibility of truly bringing Poppaea back. If only, he slurred, looking at Sporus with a terrible gleam in his eye. If only you could be truly hers, her form, her essence, completely. The next morning, 2 imperial physicians, their faces impassive and professional, entered Sporus's rooms. They carried with them a leather case of polished surgical instruments. Sporus, who had just turned 14, did not understand at first. He looked at them with wide, questioning eyes. When one of the physicians explained, in a calm, detached voice, what the emperor had commanded, the world dissolved into a maelstrom of terror. His pleas were ignored. His frantic struggles were met with the dispassionate strength of the palace guards. He was carried to a sterile, marble-lined room, the scent of wine and strong herbs hanging in the air. He saw the glint of a blade, heard the final, clinical instruction, and then his world was consumed by a white-hot agony that erased all thought, all identity, all hope. He screamed until his throat was raw, a sound that was swallowed by the opulent, indifferent walls of the Golden Palace. What followed was a long, hazy period of pain and recovery. But it was not just a physical healing. It was a systematic erasure. The boy named Sporus was being surgically, psychologically, and spiritually unmade. When he was finally able to walk again, his attendants no longer addressed him as Sporus. They called him Domina or Sabina. The simple tunics of his boyhood were gone, replaced by the fine linen stolas and silk palace of a Roman matron. His dark curls were painstakingly styled in the elaborate fashion of the late Empress. They taught him how to walk with a woman's gait, how to lower his eyes demurely, how to speak in a softer, higher-pitched voice. Any flicker of his former self, a flash of anger, a moment of masculine defiance, a tear of despair, was met with cold disapproval or, worse, the emperor's volatile rage. He learned that survival depended on the complete and utter annihilation of the boy he had once been. The castration was the physical act, but this was the true mutilation. It was a hollowing out of his soul. In the quiet of his luxurious prison, Sporus would sometimes catch his reflection in a polished silver mirror. He would see the face of a beautiful stranger, a tragic parody of a woman, with his own haunted, terrified eyes staring back. He was a ghost in his own body, a living monument to a dead woman's memory and a mad emperor's grief. The unmaking was complete. Now, the creation of Nero's new empress could begin. The wedding of Nero and Sporus was the most grotesque spectacle Rome had witnessed in a generation. And in a city accustomed to imperial excess, that was a truly remarkable feat. The ceremony was not a quiet, private affair hidden within the palace walls. Nero, in his madness, insisted on a full public wedding, complete with all the traditional rites and rituals. He wanted the world to see that he had not just found a new consort, but that he had, through the sheer force of his will, resurrected his beloved Poppaea. Sporus was led to the altar dressed as a bride. He wore a tunica recta, the traditional white woven gown of a Roman bride, and was veiled in a flammeum, a flame-colored veil that obscured his features but could not hide his trembling. A dowry was formally provided, a legal fiction of staggering audacity. The marriage contract was signed and witnessed by stunned, silent senators who dared not defy their emperor. The traditional wedding vows were exchanged, Nero's voice booming with a delusional triumph, Sporus's a barely audible whisper. Ancient sources like Cassius Dio and Suetonius described the scene with a sense of horrified disbelief. This Sporus he carried about with him in a litter and decked out in the fine attire of an empress, Suetonius wrote. And he not only kissed him from time to time, but on one occasion in Greece, he even went through a regular wedding ceremony with him, with a dowry and a bridal veil. Following the ceremony, Sporus, now publicly and irrevocably Sabina, was forced to inhabit his new role. Life became a constant, terrifying performance. He was paraded through the streets of Rome and later, on a tour through Greece, seated in a litter, adorned in the finest imperial regalia. He was the Empress, and the entire imperial household was commanded to treat him as such. Servants bowed before him, addressing him with the feminine titles of Domina and Augusta. He was required to attend public functions, theatrical performances, and gladiatorial games, sitting at Nero's side on the imperial dais. Nero's delusion was absolute. He would address Sporus as my wife or my Poppaea in public, speaking to him of state matters, gossiping about court intrigue, and expecting him to respond in character. The emperor's affection was a suffocating, unpredictable force. It could manifest as moments of genuine tenderness, where Nero would shower him with lavish gifts, pearls, silks, and estates that had once belonged to the real Poppaea. In these moments, Nero seemed to truly believe he was with his lost wife, his eyes filled with a sad, desperate love. But this affection could curdle into violent rage in an instant. If Sporus failed to perfectly embody the memory of the dead empress, if his voice was too low, his gesture too masculine, his expression not what Nero expected, the emperor would fly into a fury. These tirades were terrifying, a reminder that Sporus was not a beloved wife, but a cherished possession, and a possession could be broken. The psychological toll on Sporus was immeasurable. He lived in a state of constant hypervigilance, every word and action a calculated performance designed to appease his volatile master. He was trapped in a prison of identity, his own self buried so deep it was almost forgotten. The boy from the Subura who loved poetry, the son of the scribe Lycomedes, was gone. In his place was the Empress Sabina, a beautiful, tragic doll, her every move controlled by the strings of an emperor's madness. He was the most powerful woman in the world, and the most powerless person imaginable, his existence a chilling testament to the absolute corruption of unchecked authority. This bizarre, horrifying union would continue, a spectacle of imperial decay played out before the horrified eyes of an empire that was itself teetering on the brink of collapse. The gilded, dreamlike world of the Domus Aurea, with its endless feasts and theatrical performances, was a fantasy that could not last. While Nero composed odes to Sporus's beauty and orchestrated their bizarre domestic life, the foundations of the Roman Empire were cracking. The year 68 AD dawned with the rumble of distant thunder. Revolts, once a minor nuisance on the frontiers, erupted with terrifying force. In Gaul, the governor Gaius Julius Vindex rose in open rebellion, denouncing Nero as a tyrant and a disgrace. More ominously, in Hispania, the respected and elderly governor Servius Sulpicius Galba declared his allegiance not to Nero, but to the Senate and people of Rome. The news shattered the fragile reality of the imperial court. Nero's reaction was not that of a seasoned leader, but of a spoiled artist whose performance had been interrupted. He vacillated wildly between moments of theatrical bravado and crippling despair. One day, he would boast of leading an army of women and eunuchs, with Sporus at his side, to charm the rebels into submission with his music. The next, he would be found weeping hysterically in his chambers, composing mournful dirges for his own downfall. For Sporus, this period was a new kind of hell. The emperor's possessive affection, once a source of suffocating dread, was now replaced by the raw terror of his paranoia. Nero clung to Sporus as his last tangible link to a world he could control, his moods swinging violently. The tender kisses could become bruising grips, the whispered endearments turning into frantic, accusing questions. Sporus, the living doll, became a barometer for the emperor's disintegrating mind. He saw the madness in Nero's eyes deepen, the fear of a cornered animal replacing the languid confidence of a god. The end came with breathtaking speed. The legions in Hispania and Gaul declared Galba emperor. The Senate, smelling blood in the water and finally finding its courage, declared Nero a public enemy. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own elite protectors, abandoned him, their loyalty bought by promises from Galba's agents. Nero, the master of the world, was suddenly a fugitive in his own city. Panic consumed the Golden Palace. The opulent halls, once filled with fawning courtiers, were suddenly empty. Nero, stripped of his power and his audience, was just a man, and a terrified one at that. In the dead of night, he fled the palace with only a handful of his most loyal freedmen. Among them, cloaked and hooded against the night, was Sporus. The flight was an ignominious scramble through the dark, deserted streets of Rome. The divine emperor, the celebrated artist, was forced to hide his face, his frantic flight punctuated by the sounds of distant shouts proclaiming his death and Galba's rise. They found refuge in a modest villa outside the city, owned by his freedman Phaon. But it was no refuge. The walls were closing in. The final hours were a pathetic tableau of terror and self-pity. Nero, cowering and indecisive, ordered a grave to be dug for him, weeping at its dimensions, lamenting that such a great artist should perish. He paced back and forth, clutching a pair of daggers but lacking the courage to use them. He would turn to his companions, to Sporus, and beg them to kill him first, to show him how a man should die. Sporus watched this final, pathetic performance, his own terror a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He was a creature of the emperor's making, a person whose entire existence was defined by Nero's whim. With his creator about to be extinguished, what would become of him? He was not Sporus the freedman's son anymore, and he was certainly not the Empress Sabina. He was a notorious anomaly, a living symbol of the deposed tyrant's perversions. As the sound of approaching horsemen grew louder, Nero knew his time was up. With a trembling hand, he placed a dagger to his throat. "What an artist dies in me," he famously whispered. But still, he hesitated. It was his secretary, Epaphroditus, who finally forced the emperor's hand, pushing the blade into his neck. Nero fell to the ground, his imperial robes stained with his own blood, his eyes wide with a final, surprised horror. The most powerful man in the world died in a freedman's villa, a pathetic and ignominious end to a reign of spectacle and cruelty. Sporus stood over the body of the man who had been his husband, his master, his captor, and his creator. The puppet master's strings had been cut, and the living doll, the Empress Sabina, was left utterly alone, adrift in a hostile world that was about to decide his fate. The death of Nero did not bring freedom for Sporus. It merely brought a change of masters. He was no longer a person but a piece of property, a spoil of war. In the chaotic power vacuum that followed Nero's suicide, known to history as the Year of the Four Emperors, Sporus became a living symbol, a political token to be claimed and used by the men vying for the throne. The first to claim him was Nymphidius Sabinus, the ambitious prefect of the Praetorian Guard who had betrayed Nero and helped engineer Galba's rise. Nymphidius, in a grotesque imitation of the fallen emperor, also married Sporus, taking the name Sabina for himself as if to absorb some of Nero's imperial legitimacy through this bizarre union. For Sporus, it was a horrifying continuation of his nightmare. He was once again forced into the role of the imperial consort, this time for a brutish soldier who lacked even Nero's veneer of artistic sensibility. The degradation was no longer wrapped in the silks of the Domus Aurea but in the coarse wool of the barracks. Nymphidius's ambition, however, outstripped his political skill. When he attempted to have himself declared emperor in place of the approaching Galba, his own soldiers turned on him and killed him. Once again, Sporus was left masterless, a prize to be passed to the next victor. When the new emperor, Galba, arrived in Rome, Sporus was brought before him. Galba was a stern, old-school Roman, a man who prided himself on discipline and tradition. He was disgusted by the excesses of Nero's reign, and Sporus stood before him as the most vivid and perverse symbol of that decay. While Galba did not continue the charade of marrying Sporus, he kept the boy in his household, a curiosity and a reminder of the depravity he had replaced. Sporus's life was one of quiet humiliation, his every move scrutinized by men who saw him as an unnatural creature, a stain on the honor of Rome. Galba's reign was short-lived. In January of 69 AD, he was assassinated in the Roman Forum, and Marcus Salvius Otho, a former friend of Nero, seized power. Otho, unlike Galba, had been part of Nero's decadent inner circle. He had known the real Poppaea Sabina. In fact, he had been her husband before Nero forced him to divorce her. Upon becoming emperor, Otho took possession of Sporus. Ancient sources suggest that Otho treated Sporus with a strange, almost gentle consideration. He, too, called Sporus Poppaea, but perhaps with a different inflection. Not the delusion of Nero, but a wistful, melancholic nostalgia for a world and a woman he had lost. For a brief few months, Sporus may have found a semblance of peace. Otho, embroiled in a civil war against his rival Vitellius, had little time for the elaborate theatricals of his predecessor. Sporus was a quiet companion, a ghost of a shared past. But this respite was fleeting. Otho's forces were defeated by the armies of Vitellius in April of 69 AD. Rather than face capture or prolong the civil war, Otho chose to commit suicide, an act that ancient historians praised for its dignity and self-sacrifice. With Otho's death, Sporus's fate fell into the hands of the new emperor, Vitellius, a man notorious for his gluttony and cruelty. Vitellius had no sentimental attachment to Poppaea or the Neronian court. He saw Sporus only as a tool for public spectacle and humiliation. His plan was the most degrading yet. He intended to force Sporus to play the role of a maiden being ravished in a gladiatorial reenactment of the rape of Persephone, a public performance of sexual violence for the entertainment of the Roman mob. For Sporus, this was the final, unbearable indignity. He had been unmade, renamed, paraded, and possessed. He had been forced to live as the ghost of a dead woman, his own identity systematically annihilated. The prospect of being publicly violated in the arena, his private trauma turned into a grotesque public entertainment, was a horror beyond endurance. The boy who had been denied any choice in his life was now faced with one final, terrible decision. The news of Vitellius's plan spread through the palace like a fever. The arena, the place of blood and spectacle, was to be the final stage for Sporus's humiliation. He was to be stripped of the last vestiges of his humanity, his body used as a prop in a mythological play of violence and violation, all for the amusement of a baying crowd. The emperor, in his crude cruelty, saw it as a fitting end for a creature of Nero's making, a final public mockery of the fallen tyrant. For Sporus, the prospect was a precipice. He looked back on the years of his life, the brief, sunlit memories of a boy in the Subura, the gilded terror of the Domus Aurea, the horrifying succession of masters who had treated him as a political token. He had survived the blade, he had survived the psychological erasure, he had survived the mad love of one emperor and the callous possession of others. But this final degradation was a fate he could not accept. He was a prisoner, but in his mind he found a final sliver of freedom. He had been denied the power to choose how to live, but he realized, with a chilling clarity, that he still possessed the power to choose how to die. It was the only agency he had left, the last act of defiance in a life defined by powerlessness. The ancient historian Cassius Dio records what happened next. Sporus, understanding the fate that awaited him, preempted the emperor's grotesque spectacle. He chose to end his own life. The exact method is lost to history, whether by a hidden blade, by poison, or by some other desperate means we do not know. But the act itself was an unambiguous declaration. It was a rejection of the role he had been forced to play, a final, tragic assertion of his fundamental self. In his final moments, was he Sporus, the freedman's son? Or was he the Empress Sabina, a tragic figure finally succumbing to her sorrow? Perhaps he was neither, and both, a broken human being reclaiming the one thing that could not be taken from him: the choice to end his own suffering. His death was not a grand, public event. It was a quiet, desperate act in the shadows of a palace, a final, silent scream against a world that had sought to completely consume him. The suicide of Sporus in 69 AD was a minor footnote in the bloody history of the Year of the Four Emperors. Vitellius, deprived of his planned entertainment, likely gave it little thought. He was soon embroiled in his own battle for survival against the forces of Vespasian, a struggle he would ultimately lose, his own body being dragged through the streets of Rome and cast into the Tiber. The great men who had used Sporus as a pawn in their games of power all met violent ends, their reigns brief and brutal. But the story of Sporus, the boy who became a living doll, survived. The tragedy of Sporus is not just a lurid tale of imperial depravity. It is a profound and disturbing exploration of identity, power, and the resilience of the human spirit. In a world where absolute authority could literally reshape a person's body and command the erasure of their identity, Sporus' story serves as a haunting reminder of the ultimate vulnerability of the individual in the face of unchecked power. He was a symptom of a sick and dying system, a person whose humanity was deemed less important than the psychological whims of a succession of tyrants. His life illuminates the dark corners of Roman society, where the lives of the powerless freedmen, slaves, and women were expendable, their bodies and souls mere property to be used and discarded. Yet, in his final act, Sporus reclaimed a measure of dignity. By choosing death over a final public degradation, he demonstrated that even when stripped of everything, a human being can still possess an inner core of self that refuses to be completely broken. His suicide was not a surrender. It was a victory of a tragic kind, a final, defiant assertion that his life and his death were his own. The name Sporus echoes through the annals of history, a whisper of a stolen life. He is a testament to the countless, nameless individuals crushed beneath the wheels of great empires, their personal tragedies lost in the grand narratives of conquest and politics. His story forces us to look beyond the marble facades and imperial triumphs, and to see the profound human cost of absolute power. He was the castrated boy who became Nero's living doll, a tragic figure whose life and death serve as a timeless and chilling warning. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more true hidden history stories.